There is one monster in all of Godzilla history that posed a real challenge for Godzilla. A creature with weapons that are difficult to counter, size that will make Godzilla look small, and an evil personality. It's this one, Destoroyah. Today on Goji Center, we'll provide an answer to a question everyone's been wondering about. What if Destoroyah made his debut in the monsterverse? Will he look similar? How does the monsterverse timeline set up the return of this kaiju? And finally, will this creature be more powerful than Godzilla? Stay until the end to find out. Before we start talking about the monsterverse at all, let's do a quick recap and refresh our memories on the history and abilities of this kaiju. This is important because by doing this, we'll have a very good idea of how this guy will fit into the monsterverse. Destoroyah first appeared in the 1995 film Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, the last of the Heisei Godzilla series. But it didn't always look like this. Going back a few decades, in 1954, in the original Godzilla film, we witnessed the use of a weapon known as the Oxygen Destroyer, used to kill Godzilla in Tokyo Bay. What nobody knew was that in this precise location, ancient Precambrian crustaceans underwent mutations thanks to the effects of this weapon, instigating an evolutionary process that would bring forth nightmarish creatures that would only be countered with a combination of maser cannons, the high-tech aircraft Super X-3, AH-64 Apaches, and Type 90 tanks. This footage courtesy of War Thunder, our sponsor. If you enjoy the high adrenaline rush of simulated warfare, taking command of vast amounts of combat vehicles on multiplayer maps on land, sea, air, and blowing things up, this game is for you, dude. And no, you don't have to pay anything. It's free to play on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. We at Goji Center strongly back this game up because the in-game experience and attention to details make this second to none. Graphics, physics, and sound have come a long way and are only getting better. All advanced military tech is available, and you have the option to break through the front line in a tank or stay up and cover ground vehicles from a helicopter and participate in fighter battles in the clouds. And we got none of the outdated health bar crap here. Every hit on the enemy has a different effect. Disable their track and your opponent can't move. Hit the fuel tank and the plane goes boom. Dance of Dragons is the name of the most epic update yet. This game has now added a whole line of French combat boats, the American attack aircraft A-10 Thunderbolt, the tactical bomber F-111, and the top-tier Chinese fighter jets J-10A and JF-17. If you're ready to dive into the best military game experience of your life, click the link below, and all new players or those that haven't played for 6 months or more will get rentals for the P-40E aircraft and M4 tank for a week with unique skins, special decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, 3 premium vehicles for free, and a week of premium account and more. Hurry, because the American vehicle bonus season will end soon. Let's all thank War Thunder for sponsoring today's episode, and now let's return to Destoroyah. The reason why Destoroyah wound up this big and resistant was due to the mutations it went through as the micro-oxygen from the Oxygen Destroyer integrated itself into this animal's biology. What makes this kaiju unique is the fact that this creature comes in many different forms. This will be important to keep in mind once we start talking about its appearance in the monsterverse. The first form was its microform. After the micro-oxygen mutated this animal, these began evolving into a crawling form, feeding itself and eventually reaching sizes that would surpass humans and end up looking like pure nightmare fuel. Unlike the other kaiju Godzilla had faced in the past, these creatures would come together and morph into what was known as an aggregate form. This and the previous forms were similar in that these animals looked very similar to a walking crustacean with many limbs, covered by a thick red-colored armor resistant to many firearms. It was at this stage, however, where a few kinks in its armor were beginning to be identified. It was identified that constant exposure to extreme temperatures, in combination with explosive force, would begin compromising this creature's armor. This was a weakness in the smaller juvenile forms, and we'll see in a little bit that this would be a serious problem later. The aggregate form was a result of a supernatural phenomenon where these animals would combine themselves into a stronger and larger creature. This already sounds bad enough, but it gets worse. This aggregate form can morph into a flying creature, seemingly gliding through the air without relying on flapping its wings to sustain itself in the air. Destoroyah would, and for the final time, change its form yet again. This time turning into what was known as its perfect form. This one is the only iteration of Destoroyah that stood on two legs, and one that seemingly developed a full Indo and exoskeleton. It is here where it would begin causing some real serious trouble to Godzilla. And if
Chips Ahoy! So many flavors.
And if this form were to be translated into the monsterverse, it would be even worse. The original perfect form of Destoroyah stood a whopping 120 meters in height. That is around the same height as legendary Godzilla in 2019 and beyond. Compared to Godzilla in the film, we're talking about almost a 66-foot difference. Destoroyah was equipped with robust arms with 3 claws oriented in a way that it could hold an opponent or clench these together to serve as piercing weapons. Its hallmark frill is present among most of its different forms, with a prominent horn in the center of its head. Wingspan-wise, we're talking about 210 meters. That is 689 feet. Equally as intimidating, the Destroyer had a very long tail, present in most of its forms, but most lethal in its flying and perfect forms. Tipped with a pincer-like appendage that could hold and drag opposing kaiju, and equipped with energy-absorbing properties that would drain energy from its opponents. Now that we're talking about weapons, we'll go ahead and highlight a few that will probably make a transition to a monsterverse version of Destoroyah in some way or form. Beginning with its oxygen blast, which was present in the juvenile, aggregate, flying, and perfect forms. This blast was described as having the power of the oxygen destroyer that ended up killing Godzilla. Earlier in the film, in a live interview, Dr. Ajuin did mention that this stuff was powerful enough to penetrate metal, meaning that this could be used as a world-ending weapon. A fun-sized version of this destructive force was present in these smaller crustaceans, but as Destoroyah began reaching larger sizes, this weapon began to show signs of being much more powerful. Destoroyah in its aggregate form was able to inflict a fatal wound to Godzilla Jr., injecting this destructive matter inside its body, causing him to foam in the mouth and suffocate. This micro-oxygen served another purpose, a way to send up bits of DNA into Destoroyah's system. Yeah, that's right, Destoroyah can absorb DNA from other kaiju. This act allowed Destoroyah to then be able to evolve once more and develop an endoskeleton and a posture with similar limb arrangement to its opponent Godzilla. Its horn and frill didn't go anywhere. This thing in particular proved to be a lethal weapon. Known as a variable slicer, this thing would be supercharged with energy and as a result able to inflict more damage, cutting right through Godzilla's thick armor. This energy flux inside the horn itself would then act as a sharpening agent, enabling this horn to pierce the thickest of armor. But perhaps the most frightening attribute of this kaiju was its malevolence. Before this, Godzilla would have faced evil forces as well, but not so much as the monster in this film. One who clearly enjoyed taking its time in the act of killing and knew exactly what it was doing. Destoroyah, apart from looking like a demon, quite literally acted like one. This was the last and only time Destoroyah appeared in a film. It did appear in video games and comics, but not on the big screen. But what if it did appear in the monsterverse? Does this cinematic universe set the stage for the return of this monster? The answer is a solid yes. The directors of Godzilla King of the Monsters saw fit to reintroduce another element present in the classic Godzilla films, the introduction of the Oxygen Destroyer. Put very simply, the way this weapon works is basically like this. A bomb filled with chemical compounds would be detonated in the waters where the target would be at. During its release, a chemical reaction would remove the oxygen from the water, creating an environment that is lethal to all living organisms. This can also lead to cellular destruction and imminent death in the creature affected by it. So, since we already have an oxygen destroyer detonation happening in the Monsterverse timeline, we would have a good excuse for some ancient life form who happened to be in the way of this blast to one day evolve to become the new Destoroyah. But who knows? Maybe this creature already exists in this timeline. From this point on, the remainder of this episode is 100% pure speculation, so treat all of this with a grain of salt. After all, you're all here to see a what-if scenario. So, with that in mind, let's talk about where Destoroyah might be in the Monsterverse. Our speculative Destoroyah timeline will begin in 2019 in Isla de Mara off the coast of Mexico. After the detonation of the Oxygen Destroyer, several Precambrian crustaceans made contact with this chemical reaction. The origin of these in the Monsterverse could be one of many. Some may have just been already present in the surrounding strata, or to make things more interesting, these may have made their way to the surface from a near Hollow Earth vortex, a place where many creatures resembling prehistoric organisms can swim up from. Once making contact with this chemical reaction, these crustaceans would have mutated over time. Come the events of GXK and the discovery of even more titans. Monarch would at this point still be oblivious to the existence of these constantly mutating organisms. With each passing day, these small creatures begin evolving, reproducing themselves mutation after mutation. If you recall from the 1995 film, the power of micro-oxygen was wielded not just by the latter forms of Destoroyah, but also the smaller forms. And since we already established that Destoroyah is able to absorb DNA from its victims and integrate characteristics of its prey into itself, it's likely that Destoroyah would attain characteristics of other classes of animals. At some point during the Monsterverse timeline, these sea-dwelling animals may have grown large enough to catch and mutilate big prey. Prey big enough to catch the attention of humans. The findings of large marine animals and consistent types of wounds on prey animals will eventually catch the attention of Monarch, who will eventually connect the dots and begin the search of whatever it is that is killing these animals. At this size, the crustaceans would be large enough to cause damage to larger life forms. In the original 1995 film, it was at this point when these creatures began making contact with humans. If Destoroyah ever makes it into the big screen in this franchise, our best guess is that they wouldn't skimp on the opportunity to make these monsters interact with humans face to face at a more personal level. At this point, the micro-oxygen blast of these animals would be strong enough to mortally wound humans in an instant. Bulletproof and numerous, a horde of these crustaceans from hell would be nothing short of a horrific thing to witness. Monarch would have collected enough samples at this point to figure out where these things came from and whose fault it was. Humans. More specific. More specifically, the United States military. This oxygen destroyer would once again bite humanity in the ass after a few decades. And given that these creatures seem to have a mind of their own and a special affinity to destroying things and becoming bigger and more powerful, someone else will begin to take note of this growing threat. Destoroyah is one of the very few examples of kaiju who didn't rely on radiation to mutate and become a monster of massive proportions. It only seemed to have relied on rapid evolutionary forces and the implementation of micro-oxygen. If this was still the case in the Monsterverse, Destoroyah's only means of becoming more powerful wouldn't be targeting nuclear power plants like Scylla or the G-Man, but rather targeting other large monsters to then absorb their energy, DNA, and then becoming more powerful. And the other most powerful creatures in this universe at this point in time would be the Alpha Titans, such as Kong, Shimo, Mothra, and Godzilla himself. In the eyes of Destoroyah, these titans, amongst other powerful titans like Rodan, for instance, would be seen as a buffet instead of just another form of opposition. Admittedly, the Monsterverse rendition of Destoroyah would still welcome radioactive energy with open arms. Before we talk about how powerful Destoroyah could be in this universe, let's quickly talk about how Destoroyah would look in the Monsterverse. The first thing that comes to mind is size, and this thing in this universe would be nothing short of massive. We aren't here to predict exactly how big, but for fun, let's use the size comparison between Destoroyah and Godzilla in the 1995 film. If we use the same size difference ratio seen in this movie, this means that proportionally speaking, we are looking at a Destoroyah that is around 471 feet in height. This isn't taller than an upright Shimo or Ghidorah. Size in this case isn't the most dangerous characteristic of this monster. More on this in a little bit. Now to physical characteristics. In this more grounded and realistic take on a kaiju universe, design-wise, some of the physical traits of Destoroyah's final perfect form won't really hold up in the Monsterverse. That said, the overall designs of the crawl, juvenile, aggregate, and even the flying form hold up kind of well by today's design standards. With a bit of tweaking, the flying form of Destoroyah would still look pretty good in a Monsterverse film. It's the perfect form that will need some work. Why? Well, if you remember, Destoroyah's perfect form was also capable of flight. The problem here is that an animal this bulky, with especially thick legs, would have a very hard time flying with wings this small. To raise an animal like this into the air requires massive amounts of force, This requires stronger muscles and larger wings. There are many talented artists online who already took a stab at making a monsterverse version of Destoroyah. Some of these include those made by Jared Medina or Sangoon. More updated versions of the Destroyer kaiju that would fit well with the monsterverse's monster aesthetics. One common characteristic of these newer artist renditions is the incrementing of the wing's surface area. Some, such as this one, even went as far as reducing the mass of the legs and increasing the muscle mass on the chest and back, as to give more power to the wings that will aid in flight. In general, a Destoroyah would have to follow these design choices for it to be able to fly, realistically, more or less. Larger chest and back muscles to provide enough muscle power to sustain flight, a larger set of wings to provide enough surface area to push sufficient air downwards to then allow the body to levitate. Lightweight but extremely resistant chitinous armor, not too heavy to make this creature exert too much energy while flying, and reduced mass on its legs as compared to its original form in 1995. These attributes are a good starting point to make Destoroyah comfortably fit in the design choices of other MonsterVerse kaiju. As we can see, Destoroyah, if it does indeed match these parameters, would be an absolute unit of a monster. Unmatched in terms of strength, and in this case, even in power. In the MonsterVerse, the only man-made weapon that came close to killing Godzilla was the Oxygen Destroyer. This time, this power will be wielded by another, presumably larger and more powerful monster. The ability to shoot micro-oxygen blasts still holds up in this universe. This would be a blast that would burn and cut. And for the first time in the MonsterVerse, we may actually see Godzilla suffer from many numerous cuts, gashes, and nasty lacerations on its body. If Godzilla does indeed survive this fight, these types of wounds would inflict scars that would last a lifetime. And that's on the heavily armored Godzilla. Any other weaker kaiju would have suffered a grim fate. Speaking of gore-inflicting weapons, the variable slicer of this monster will still hold up in this cinematic universe. Having a superheated knife in the middle of its forehead and, used correctly, Destoroyah would have yet another weapon that could easily dispatch any lesser kaiju with a single stab. Its tail would have been the most powerful we've seen, potentially much longer than that of Godzilla's, or around the same size as Shimo's. This tail would not only have impact forces capable of killing with a well-placed hit, but also grab and hold an opposing titan, strangling it and absorbing its energy. As Destoroyah continuously evolves with each form stronger than the previous, it will probably take a team effort of titans to take down this monster. That said, here at Goji Center, we do think that adding Destoroyah to the roster of MonsterVerse kaiju is a must. But it's too early. Destoroyah is the type of titan that should be saved for the end game. It's simply too powerful. This showdown between Destoroyah and Godzilla will require an Alpha Titan at his best, most powerful form not seen yet. Currently in the MonsterVerse timeline, Destoroyah may already be lurking the seas as a microbe or a frightening man-eating crustacean, waiting for the right moment to strike.